Hello YouTube, and welcome back to another book review from me, your host, Logan Albright. Today I wanted to talk about an author that I've never read before, but I should have read before. And that's just something I'm trying to do in general. I'm trying to explore authors who I know by reputation, but I've never actually read, and that authors that I should have read in order to have a complete education. I like to think of myself as fairly well educated. I've read a lot of books, but there's plenty of authors that I've just never gotten the time to check out. And so I'm trying to remedy that. I recently read this Camille Paglia book, which I've talked about, which is sort of like a reading list for all of the Western canon. And there's so much in there that I haven't read. And one of the authors that she likes to talk about a lot is Lord Byron. And I've never read Lord Byron. Of course, I know who he is. I'm familiar with him, but I've never read anything he's written, even though he wrote a lot. So I decided to traipse down to my local used bookstore and see if I could find anything by him. And in fact, I found this beautiful hardcover slipcase edition of the epic poem Don Juan by Lord Byron in this Heritage Press edition from 1971 with illustrations by Hugo Steiner, who I don't know who that is, but the illustrations are quite cool, very fun. And this is about a 350-page epic poem about the exploits of the famous Don Juan. And most people will know who Don Juan is. He's sort of renowned as this, Casanova ladies' man, goes out and sleeps with lots of women. And it's interesting because he's been portrayed in many other forms. Obviously, I know him from the Mozart opera, Don Giovanni, the Giovanni being the Italian form of Juan. He's not a hero in that story. He's sort of a bad guy, and it's easy to portray someone like that as a bit of a predator, perhaps, someone who goes around and seduces women against their will and then leaves them. It's sort of a bad thing to do. And it's interesting that Byron's take is extremely different than that. The Don Juan in this story is young, boyish, slight, skinny, kind of effeminate, kind of feminine beauty. And he is not much of an agent on his own behalf. He doesn't really take a lot of actions to improve his situation or accomplish anything. Instead, he keeps kind of falling into the arms of these women, most of whom are in a much more superior position to his own. They tend to be older than him. They tend to be more well established than him. A lot of them are royalty. He ends up going to England and Russia and Greece and all these places, and kind of gets he captivates the queens and the princesses and the empresses of these lands and becomes kind of part of their little harem or something. And it's all kind of not through his own doing. It just sort of happens to him. Women find him irresistible, but he doesn't go after them so much. So that's sort of a very different, much more passive, kind of role reversal almost take on Don Juan, which I found really interesting from Byron here. I really like this style of poetry, this kind of narrative epic poetry. I was very much reminded in this book of this other one I recently read by Anthony Burgess, Burn, a Novel in Verse, which tells the story of this sort of, Irishman who's a bit of a cad. And it's got a very similar style. It starts at the very beginning with Don Juan's parents and tells about his birth and his upbringing, and then it tells about his travels to all these different lands. And it goes on and on and on. And it was unfinished at the time of Byron's death. It runs to 16 cantos and then a little bit of a 17th, which was not finished at the time Byron died, which is a real shame because there's no conclusion to the story. It just sort of peters out. And that's one of my criticisms of the story, is that it doesn't really go anywhere. And it becomes quite circular in the sense that each canto is just Juan's adventures in a different land with a different woman. And this is largely to do some social commentary on different societies and their customs. And there's, Byron actually calls it what does he call it? A satirical epic of modern life. So there's a little bit of satire there, which is interesting. But Don Juan just kind of disappears from the story quite a lot while Byron goes on some long tangents to talk about other things. And the story doesn't really feel like it's going anywhere. It doesn't feel like there's a lot of forward motion in the later part of the book, I would say. In the earlier part of the book, I don't feel that way. I think the earlier part of the book is sublime and great. And in fact, this is some of the best poetry I've ever read. My favorite long poem is Paradise Lost, and always has been. I think it's fantastic. But this sort of approaches in parts my love for Paradise Lost, in that it's just so well written, and Byron has such a great command of the language and such a great, has such a obvious fun playing with words and rhymes and coming up with exotic and interesting rhymes, not just the same old ones that you see over and over again. He really kind of stretches, and sometimes to the point of kind of breaking the metrical scheme or breaking the rhyme scheme a little bit, some kind of half rhymes and some things that don't quite squeeze into the meter. but he's having so much fun with it that I think it's just great. The rhyme scheme and the metrical scheme is iambic pentameter, 6-line verses with the rhyme scheme A, B, A, B, C, C. And that's carried on throughout, which is quite fun. I'm enjoying that. And one of the things I think is really interesting and great about this book is the way Byron kind of switches back and forth between different registers. He will often be very witty and wry and satirical and jokey and do rhymes that make you laugh and do little funny turns of phrase. And then in the very next sentence, he'll like be completely earnest and have a beautiful, just like incredibly well-drawn poetic description of romantic love or something like that, you know? So there's some really heartfelt stuff in there, and there's some really gorgeous descriptions of you know, the human emotions or landscape or anything that feel really sincere, and then he'll turn around and then make a joke out of it in a few stanzas later. And I like that going back and forth because it doesn't get stale, it doesn't get repetitive. It becomes, the rhymes are always fun, and the poetry is always fun to read because you get a lot of different stuff out of it. I think he was really, really great at that. However, I do think the poem is too long, and it does sort of get wearisome towards the end or towards the second half because so much of the same stuff happens, and it really doesn't go anywhere. So I think it could have used an editor. He could have decided to end it far earlier, and it would have improved it. But what's there is often just so great and so fun that I would highly recommend it to anybody who's interested in narrative poetry. And I'll have to check out more Byron. So if you have any other recommendations of things by Byron that are worth reading, please leave them in the comments below. And I will get back to you again next week with another book review. I'll have to decide what I'm going to read for this week. It's been pretty busy, but I'll try to come up with something. I try to release a video every Wednesday, so stay tuned for that. And if you enjoyed this review of Byron's Don Juan, which is excellent and I recommend you read, please like the video and subscribe to the channel and click that bell for notifications. I'm going to go now. It was nice talking to you all. Always good to see you. And I hope you enjoyed this talking about Lord Byron's Don Juan epic. I've been your host, Logan Albright. Thanks so much for watching, and I will catch you next time.